Cell number 8 by Sunbird Riding Shotgun. Chapter 3. Eliot woke up before the sun. He lay there, staring at the darkness above, thinking, feeling. He felt better. He was healing quickly, all things considered. His strength was coming back and the pain was fading away. But it was more than that. He still felt tired, and Amy was still in his mind like a dull ache, ready to flare up at a moment's thought. But at the same time, it was easier, just a little easier. He was waiting to get better, but he was also anticipating sunrise in a way he couldn't really remember doing before. At sunrise, Nate would wake up and check Eliot's injuries, and they'd eat breakfast, and then they'd play chess. Maybe Nate would even include one of those little lessons about different strategies or something, and maybe Eliot would be able to surprise Nate with something. Yesterday, Eliot had found out he liked surprising Nate. The older man would get quiet, a look on his face like he was considering 100 different possibilities, and then after figuring out what everything meant, he'd get that little smile of approval. Eliot was honest with himself, if no one else. That smile made him feel good, warm inside. It dulled the ache a little. And the chess. Eliot knew chess now. Well, he knew how to play. Nate said no one could really know chess completely, which according to him was one of the great things about the game. But Nate said Eliot was picking it up quickly. It was strange, but that made him feel good. Like yesterday had meant something more than just another day of treading water to keep breathing. He knew how to play chess, and that was something he had that no one could take away from him. No matter what happened to him, he could close his eyes and play chess in his head. It was what he'd do until Nate woke up. An hour later, when Nate was checking his injuries and watching cautiously as Eliot sat up under his own power, Eliot noticed the guards with breakfast were late. He hadn't been counting time, but when they did come, Eliot guessed they were almost an hour late, if not longer. Their timing had been mostly precise since his arrival. When they did come, the guards seemed agitated, arguing and muttering without a glance toward the cell's occupants before continuing the argument as they left. "This isn't good," Nate muttered, looking over his options in the chess game they'd started before moving to get the food. "Well, it's not good. The guards are upset and the higher-ups are cutting their wages. Angry guards are never a good thing for us," Nate said with a long sigh. "You speak Arabic?" "A bit. You pick things up," Nate added offhand, handing Eliot his bowl. Eliot took 2 long gulps of the mush, eating quickly. It was the best way to get through the disgusting nature. Arabic. Well, Eliot had been in Russia during the whole monkey fiasco. He picked up Russian to get by. It had been useful, and now, a month later, he realized he still knew most of it, probably all, if he practiced. It was another one of the things they couldn't take from him. It was something useful from the venture. He hadn't even made the decision fully before he was putting down his bowl. "Teach me." 2 hours or more later, when Eliot looked like he was developing a headache and was beginning to slur his words in even worse ways than he had been, Nate called a halt to the impromptu lesson on basic Arabic. Nate had thought it odd that Eliot showed sudden interest in such a passing remark, but he'd been almost eager, showing more life than Nate would have believed him capable of 2 days ago. So Nate started trying to teach. His grasp of Arabic was basic enough to get by, and a little more maybe, and Nate wasn't sure how to teach languages to begin with. But it didn't seem to matter. Eliot had attacked the opportunity with a vengeance, not even frustrated by his own difficulty to twist his accent into unfamiliar sounds. He wouldn't be speaking fluently for a long time, but Eliot had already picked up more basic phrases than most tourists ever would. The smile on the young man's face was more reward for the effort than Nate would have thought. He set up the chessboard and declared they were taking a break. After a game, Nate decided to test a theory. As they started playing chess again, Nate started to relate a story from one of the jobs he'd been on. The one with that dark-haired woman he nearly caught a few months ago. It had art in it, and he went off on a tangent about the art stolen, the fair and black market value for each piece, even the origins and artists, and which artist's work was worth the most. After rambling on through a few moves and more numbers than any normal person would remember off the top of his head, he looked up, checking to see if Eliot was getting bored. Eliot was watching him attentively, clearly paying careful attention to try to commit this all to memory. Nate repeated one of the paintings he'd mentioned earlier with a different price, and Eliot looked confused. "You said 132,000. Eliot interrupted. Just checking if you were paying attention, Nate said with a smile. Good job. Eliot shrugged, took Nate's bishop, and brushed off the direct compliment. But his long hair didn't hide the pleased smile. Before Nate even really made a conscious decision, he found himself turning nearly everything they did into some lesson or another. What Nate had discovered the first time they played chess was proven again and again as one day passed into the next. Eliot was incredibly intelligent, picking up anything Nate threw at him with startling ease. Nate managed to figure out Eliot hadn't even finished his freshman year of high school before leaving home for reasons Eliot didn't clarify. It was a shame. Nate could almost imagine under different circumstances Eliot could have done anything he'd wanted to. As smart and able to think on his feet as Eliot was, Nate had a mental image of him as some young partner in a big law firm or something, though he knew better than to share. Eliot seemed to share Nate's low opinion of most lawyers. But even in these circumstances, it was impressive. It wasn't just that Eliot could pick up whatever Nate threw at him. He wanted to. That first teach me turned out to be far from the last. If Nate said something or mentioned something and didn't explain it, it wouldn't be long before Eliot was asking. Somewhere in the back of his head, Nate acknowledged that he wasn't doing anyone any favors on explaining how a certain scam worked to an unrepentant thief, or citing the places that sold the best knives in the world. But at the same time, he didn't care. In this cell, honest man and thief had lost its meaning. They were together in this. And every little lesson drew that tired young man he'd met the night he was thrown in here a step further back into the land of the living. 4 days after they'd met, Eliot let Nate help him stand and make a loop around the cell before lying back down. It was Nate's turn to learn as Eliot taught him how to clear your head and measure the passing of time with nothing but your heartbeat. It was how Eliot knew the schedule of the guards without a watch. After they counted off an hour, Nate helped Eliot back to his feet and they made another round. Nate was about to help him back down when Eliot shook his head and they made another loop. Eliot was panting and shaking by the time Nate helped him back it down, but he only grinned at Nate's concern. I have to push myself if I want to get out of here. Nate sighed, cast about until he could think of something to lead into their latest topic while waiting for the next hour to wind away. By the end of that day, Eliot was moving by himself, and by the end of the next, Eliot declared himself on the mend enough Nate could stop hovering. He just had to get his feet under him now, and it wouldn't be long before he made his escape. Somehow neither of them had managed to talk much to each other after that. The 6th day passed bordering on awkward as reality, and that Eliot was healed enough to start plotting his escape hit them both hard. They played a couple games of chess, but somehow the camaraderie of the past 3 days had faded. Dinner never came that day. Later, Eliot would look back and remember that he'd learned from his time in Nishka's that once you learned the ways of your captors, you learned to be wary of change in behavior. A patrol being an hour late wasn't particularly upsetting. But a meal never coming when they hadn't missed one in more than a week? Eliot should have known nothing good would come of it. If he hadn't been bogged down by the fact that he was well enough to leave now and he should be planning his escape and not wondering why IYS hadn't come for Nate yet, he just might have. As it was, the whole peace of mind he seemed to have gained in the past week disappeared the moment he realized this little cell wasn't going to last much longer. He'd been taking a break from reality, learning and feeling and being treated like a human being for once, and it was nice, but it wasn't real. It wouldn't last forever. Exhaustion was already settling back around him. A night of hunger. The reminder that their lives were up to the whims of their captors reminded Eliot why he needed to get out of here. Captivity never ended well, no matter how much you liked spending time with your cellmate. He did have one advantage, though. Apparently the fact he'd been badly hurt and more or less suicidal when they'd taken him in meant they didn't consider him as much of a threat as Nishka had. He'd get one chance before that changed, but chances were he wouldn't have too hard a time getting out of this mess now that he could walk more than a few feet. Breakfast never came the 7th day, but it wasn't the lack of food that had them both concerned. There had been no water delivered to their cell since the morning before. It had been all gone since yesterday evening. Eliot had lasted 2 days with a fever and no water, but it had nearly killed him. By mid-afternoon, Eliot's renewed health was already taking a sharp decline, and they were both faced with a new terror. Neither of them knew why the deliveries had stopped, and neither of them knew if they'd start again, or if it would be before one of them died. By evening, Nate was getting desperate. Without water, neither of them would last much longer. Eliot had already reverted to laying on his pallet, staring at the ceiling and trying to conserve energy. His health was failing quickly and so close to his escape. Nate himself felt like his throat was made of sandpaper, thirst making his tongue stick to the roof of his mouth, and the first signs of dehydration had set in a while ago. Despite his better judgment, when Nate heard the tramp of boots of guards outside the cell, Nate went to the barred window, calling out in Arabic, "Please, sirs, we need water." He didn't see their expression until it was too late. "What'd you do that for?" Eliot asked, his throat scratchy, forcing himself into a sitting position. "Do you know what—" He was interrupted by keys turning in the lock and the cell door opening to reveal 3 guards. Nate didn't need to understand the words they were saying to realize his bad luck that had landed him here was back with a vengeance. Angry guards are never a good thing. His own words days ago sailed through his mind as 2 of the guards grabbed his arms and slammed him front forward into a wall while the other closed the door. His mind's processing rate seemed to slow down as some rough rope was tied around his wrists and jerked his arms over his head to catch over a hook in the wall near the ceiling. There was movement behind him, a gasp and word of protest he should have understood, but his mind went blank when a crack was followed by a white-hot pain striking him from shoulder to hip. A second blow caught him just as off guard, knocking what was left of his wind out of him and making him gasp. Nate was an insurance investigator. He was a good guy, an honest guy. He'd been in fights before, but this was new. This he didn't know what to do about. He'd lost his breath before the 4th blow, his mind fizzling out as being unable to breathe added to pain and fear, making any kind of lucid thought fly out the window. Suddenly, things stopped. The next blow didn't come. There was a scuffle and a sound of flesh hitting flesh and grunts for a few moments before he heard the telltale click of a safety being removed, and Eliot growled, "Hey, guns." Suddenly, someone was lifting him off the notch and tossing him haphazardly to the side, his head hitting the wall nearly hard enough to knock him out. Nate lay there dazed, slowly pulling himself back together and ignoring the blood he could feel sluggishly dripping along his back and trying not to go under. He had to figure out what had happened. He turned slowly, seeing guards tying a new rope around Eliot's wrists, a gun still pressed to the back of his skull. Nate's head was still spinning, but he was able to piece together enough of what they'd said to understand Eliot had tried to make his escape. Nate was confused at the sheer stupidity for all of the minute it took to get Eliot into the position he'd been in moments ago before he felt the bottom of his stomach drop out. Eliot closed his eyes, laid his cheek against the cold stone wall, and waited, the light through the barred window of the cell door shining across dozens of scars across his back. Eliot had known he'd never get away. He'd made a gambit to trade places with Nate. As the guard raised his arm for the first blow, Nate closed his eyes tight, trying to block out the sound of leather hitting flesh. All he could think was that he'd been wrong. Eliot may be a thief. He may have led a hard life. But he was already a good man.